been 72 hours since 3i Atlas passed perihelion, the closest point to the Sun. For months, scientists treated this moment as the end of a mystery. But what followed wasn't silence, it was encryption. Between October 27th and 29th, multiple observatories reported sudden data gaps, missing telemetry, vanishing light curve readings, and corrupted polarization logs. Then, something stranger. Both NASA's Parker Solar Probe and China's ASOS mission quietly pulled sections of their datasets offline. No public explanation, no cross-verification allowed. It's not the first time space has revealed something governments would rather not discuss. But this time, it's not about what the object is. It's about who controls the truth around it. Because while scientists are calling it an observational anomaly, the world's two largest powers are treating it as a signal. And in that silence, something has changed. This is where science ends and intelligence begins. Because 3i Atlas didn't just cross the Sun, it crossed into geopolitics. And tonight, we trace how an interstellar visitor turned into the centerpiece of a quiet, escalating intelligence race between the United States and China. In the opening days of the 3i Atlas discovery, the silence wasn't shocking, it was procedural. Every deep space detection, even something as historic as Oumuamua in 2017 or 2I/Borisov in 2019, had begun with a pause. The first few days were always reserved for data verification, orbital modelling, and confirmation of authenticity. But the silence surrounding 3i Atlas felt heavier, more deliberate. It wasn't a pause for precision, it was a pause for control. When the object first appeared in mid-2025, the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii recorded it as a faint, fast-moving dot against the backdrop of Serpens Caput. Within hours, algorithms flagged it as hyperbolic, a trajectory that didn't belong to the solar system. That single label, interstellar, should have triggered a cascade of collaboration. Normally, observatories worldwide would begin cross-tracking immediately. Japan, Chile, the Canary Islands, Australia, all joining a real-time race to refine the orbit. But that race never happened. The initial orbital elements were submitted to the Minor Planet Center on July 16th. Then, nothing. For almost a week, no international confirmations appeared. The usual public database that lists follow-up observations remained nearly blank. By the time secondary readings arrived, they were coming only from US-aligned facilities, primarily the Lowell Observatory in Arizona, and a handful of private telescope arrays run by NASA-affiliated contractors. Chinese observatories were absent, European ones were quiet, and the global amateur astronomy community, which had helped track nearly every significant object of the past decade, found themselves locked out of the data pipeline. At first, most assumed it was an error. The MPC's servers had crashed before. Data synchronization could lag. But when an independent astronomer from Spain noticed that the ephemeris update had been digitally signed by an internal clearance team, a detail that had never appeared before, questions began to spread quietly through private forums. That was the first sign that 3i Atlas was no ordinary comet. Behind the curtain, both governments had already moved. In Washington, a short-lived internal memo circulated through the Department of Defense's Office of Space Intelligence. It classified 3i Atlas as interstellar body, Category 3, object of unverified origin. Category 3 wasn't about trajectory, it was about potential intent. The same label used for foreign satellites performing unusual orbital maneuvers. Simultaneously in Beijing, the National Space Science Center issued its own directive. All interplanetary observation data gathered by the Purple Mountain Observatory, the Lijiang telescope, and the ASOS satellite was to be shared only with national security-approved review channels. In effect, civilian astronomers could keep watching, but anything they recorded would be filtered before leaving the country. Both memos, one American, one Chinese, used eerily similar language, sensitive material under cross-review. Neither side trusted what they were seeing. To the public, early reports were subdued. NASA issued a half-page statement acknowledging the discovery of an unusual interstellar visitor, noting its high eccentricity and volatile composition. Chinese state media mentioned it once, describing it as a minor cosmic body of uncertain chemical makeup. Then both fell silent. But inside research circles, unease was growing. At Harvard, the Center for Astrophysics team led by Dr. Ragan Mehta uploaded a preliminary spectral analysis suggesting traces of volatile nickel compounds, a rare signature inconsistent with natural comets. Within 4 hours, the paper vanished from ARXIV. The deletion notice simply read, "Retracted pending further verification." 2 days later, Chinese astronomers at the Purple Mountain Observatory published a brightness curve that fluctuated far more dramatically than expected for a natural body. The post was removed from Weibo before it reached 10 reposts. Archived versions revealed something extraordinary: a rhythmic modulation, a repeating oscillation in reflectivity that seemed to occur at 11.3-minute intervals. The data didn't prove anything, but it suggested a pattern, and patterns invite interpretation. In late August, European observatories tried to step in. The European Space Agency proposed opening a shared telemetry hub to pool data from all nations. It was standard procedure for high-interest celestial objects, but the request was denied, not by NASA or CNSS directly, but by their respective intelligence liaisons. The reason cited: potential signal contamination. Signal contamination. The phrase alone was enough to unsettle the community. It implied that 3i Atlas might be emitting something, not just reflecting sunlight. Around that same period, a quiet competition began. US radar arrays were assigned to track the object's spin rate, while China's fast radio telescope was retuned for intermittent bursts aimed near its trajectory. Both nations insisted these were scientific exercises, yet every dataset collected was marked restricted. Even allied observatories, Canada's Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, Germany's Calar Alto, were told to wait for clearance before publishing results. To the outside world, it looked like a joint global project. In reality, it was two walls rising in parallel, neither side knowing what the other was seeing. Amateurs, of course, noticed the silence. From backyard telescopes in Chile to observatories in South Africa, hundreds of independent astronomers tried to gather open data. But something strange happened. Several reported missing telemetry timestamps and corrupted image headers when uploading to shared databases. Others found their observation submissions marked as duplicate and automatically rejected. A French observer named Lucien Morel posted a thread titled, "Why can't we see it?" He wrote, "It's like half the sky went dark for a week." The post trended briefly before being deleted for misinformation. That's when the speculation began to spiral. Was the object more reflective than expected? Was it tumbling artificially? Why were both NASA and CNSA encrypting photometric data, the most basic kind of a light analysis imaginable? Inside observatories, the tension grew quieter but heavier. Astronomers knew what they were risking if they spoke. Many were working under contracts with military or dual-use funding. One leak could cost them clearance, even careers. But whispers still leaked. An internal message from a senior analyst at the ESA, later verified through an encrypted leak, stated, 3i Atlas is not being treated as a celestial event. It's a strategic observation target. We are locked out of the feed. Another message, allegedly from a NASA contractor, described something more specific. The object's albedo fluctuates too cleanly, like a panel rotating. If that's natural, it's the most geometrically consistent ice outgassing ever recorded. That sentence, like a panel rotating, would echo for weeks through hidden chat groups of astronomers and analysts alike, because it suggested shape, orientation, control. By early October, less than a month before perihelion, both the United States and China had effectively built duplicate research pipelines, two parallel realities of 3i Atlas. The same coordinates, same trajectory, but no cross-communication. NASA's solar orbiter was programmed to capture a full spectral sweep as the object approached the Sun. China's ASOS was scheduled to do the same. Both missions completed their observations. Both datasets were classified within 12 hours. And that was when the silence hardened into something more. Not the absence of information, but the creation of secrecy. Officially, the justification was data integrity. Both agencies claimed they were filtering out solar interference before releasing any results. But privately, analysts admitted the real concern was attribution. If the data hinted at artificiality, whichever nation revealed it first would lose control of the story. No one wanted to be the one to confirm that something intelligent, or at least engineered, might have crossed into our solar system. So they chose the safer path. They said nothing. Yet silence itself became a message. To intelligence agencies, the blackout was telling. To the public, it was invisible. But to those few still watching the sky, it meant only one thing. Something was unfolding that couldn't be explained through natural processes alone. By mid-October, observatories noticed small deviations in trajectory, slight enough to be dismissed as solar radiation pressure, but precise enough to appear deliberate. At the same time, signal analysts detected faint, rhythmic polarization shifts every few hours. Again, it could be random, but randomness doesn't repeat itself that neatly. Both nations saw the data. Neither made it public, and in the void between them, speculation turned into strategy. The early silence wasn't simply bureaucratic inertia. It was the first move in a new kind of information war, a quiet standoff fought not over territory, but over interpretation. Because whoever defines what 3i Atlas is, controls what it means. And that silence, heavy and deliberate, became the stage for what would follow, a full breakdown of scientific cooperation, a growing web of classified data, and an unfolding race not for knowledge, but for ownership. By the start of October, the quiet around 3i Atlas was no longer circumstantial, it was engineered. Data wasn't just missing, it was being filtered, compartmentalized and rerouted through secure networks on both sides of the Pacific. The silence had become systemic. Inside NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, a group of mid-level mission analysts noticed something strange with their crossfeed links to the European Space Operations Center. The normal telemetry synchronization channel for solar proximal bodies, known internally as HelioNet 7, had been temporarily disabled. In its place was a new encrypted relay running through the Defense Information Systems network, a military-grade backbone usually reserved for surveillance satellites, not comets. No one announced the change. It simply appeared one morning, the old network dead, the new one sealed behind authentication layers only a handful of defense-cleared scientists could access. When a software engineer questioned it during a weekly review call, the project lead replied flatly, "Directive from above. External coordination suspended until perihelion plus 7 days." No further context, no discussion. Across the ocean, in Beijing, a similar shift was unfolding. The Chinese National Space Science Center ordered its data from ASOS, the Advanced Space-Based Solar Observatory, to be rerouted away from the shared international repository used by the European Space Agency. Instead, the stream was redirected to the Strategic Deep Space Data Network, an internal relay built in 2024 for dual-use missions. Its encryption key was changed, its external access revoked, and a new clause appeared in the mission's public webpage: temporary maintenance due to solar activity interference. In other words, the same day the US shut down its link, China did too. Scientists caught in the middle began noticing the effects almost immediately. Requests for basic calibration data went unanswered, emails bounced back, even informal collaborations, the kind that had defined modern astronomy, went dark. At the European Space Agency's ESTEC campus, a veteran mission coordinator described it as watching a bridge collapse in real time. For decades, global astronomy had thrived on openness. Data moved freely, raw spectra, light curves, photometric calibrations, all shared across continents. But after 3i Atlas's perihelion window approached, every node in the system began walling itself off. ESA officials tried to smooth tensions, offering to act as a neutral relay. But both Washington and Beijing declined. Each insisted they would release the data independently after verification. Neither did. The blackout wasn't total, though. Leaked fragments began appearing, traces of coordination gone wrong. One internal NASA report mentioned foreign sensor saturation during transmission window. A Chinese memo, later leaked on Weibo before deletion, spoke of radio flux interference possibly artificial in nature. Both were dated October 27th, just 2 days before perihelion. For those following the event, it was the perfect storm of suspicion. Two nations shutting down communication at the exact same time, citing interference that neither would define. The real story lay behind those vague terms, in the few institutions still allowed partial access. One was the Deep Space Network complex in Madrid. Another was the Jiamusi ground station in northeast China. Both had overlapping telemetry coverage during perihelion, and both reported the same anomaly: intermittent bursts of high-frequency data packets not originating from any known spacecraft. To the Chinese operators, It looked like packet noise, electromagnetic interference bouncing off solar plasma. To NASA analysts, it looked like intentional modulation, data structured in a repeating binary pattern. Neither interpretation could be confirmed. But what made it stranger was timing. The bursts occurred precisely during the 5-hour window when 3E Atlas passed closest to the Sun, the exact period when visual observation was impossible. In other words, the moment humanity's instruments lost sight of the object, something began transmitting. The public didn't hear about any of this at first. Officially, perihelion went smoothly. NASA's Parker Solar Probe collected valuable solar wind data. China's ASOS reported routine observation interruptions. But deep within the encrypted channels, the tone was different. An internal US Space Command dispatch, marked confidential, eyes only, noted. Transient EM bursts of structured rhythm detected between 284 to 291 MHz. Possible correlation with object position vector at time of observation. Further analysis classified. Around the same time, Chinese analysts submitted their own classified report titled Qisheng, or 7 stars. It described 7 discrete emission intervals within a narrowband frequency range, inconsistent with natural plasma harmonics. Both reports referred to the same event. Neither admitted it publicly, and after October 30th the data vanished behind intelligence walls. That was the moment when science fractured, not from disagreement, but from containment. What had once been an open collaboration became a mirror war of information. Both nations built identical structures, intelligence committees disguised as research task forces. In the US, it was the Interstellar Object Coordination Group, OCG, a small team drawn from NASA, the Pentagon, and the National Reconnaissance Office. In China, it was the Deep Space Situational Bureau, DSSB, a hybrid between the CNSA's Science Division and the Strategic Support Force. Each group had the same mandate: monitor 3I Atlas, collect classified readings, and prepare internal threat assessments. They didn't share results, they shared suspicions. Leaked documents later revealed that by October 25th, before perihelion even began, both teams had concluded that 3I Atlas exhibited non-ballistic motion, inconsistent with solar radiation pressure models. One of the few sentences visible in the declassified fragments read simply, "Deviation is deliberate." Outside these walls, civilian scientists scrambled for scraps of data. The International Astronomical Union issued quiet requests for public updates. None came. Meanwhile, a few observatories, notably the Atacama Large Millimeter Array and the Subaru Telescope, attempted to bypass national channels by tracking reflected signals independently. Their raw data showed strange phase shifts, almost rhythmic, as if the object's orientation was changing in sync with the solar wind itself. When ALMA researchers uploaded those results to the public server, the files were quickly locked by their National Science Ministry. The reason cited: potential conflict with restricted datasets. It was becoming clear that the true silence wasn't accidental, it was administrative. Inside NASA, morale began to fracture. Several mission scientists quietly protested the growing secrecy, arguing that withholding raw data violated the agency's charter. But they were overruled. The justification, repeated across briefings, was always the same: we're not hiding, we're verifying. Verification became the new euphemism for censorship. At the same time, intelligence analysts within the Pentagon began treating 3I Atlas as a potential vector, a foreign probe or a test of detection limits. The logic was simple. If an unknown object could evade consistent tracking near the Sun, it might reveal weaknesses in early warning systems. China's analysts reached the same conclusion. To both, the object was no longer an astronomical mystery, it was a data threat. As the days passed, international collaboration crumbled completely. ESA's solar coordination meetings, once open to researchers from all nations, were abruptly reclassified as invite-only. Russian observatories were told to stay neutral. India's ISRO stopped issuing public bulletins. Even amateur telescope networks like the Las Cumbres Array saw their observation windows overridden by temporary priority access orders from defense authorities. It was a global silence, orchestrated from the top. By late October, scientists began describing the situation in hushed tones. We're studying the same object from two sides of a firewall, and that firewall wasn't digital anymore, it was ideological. What had started as data segregation became a full-blown geopolitical partition, each side convinced the other knew something it didn't. Rumours spread of intercepted signals, of missing Parker probe frames, of encrypted dark channels running through private relay satellites. None were confirmed, but none were denied either. Then came the final break. On October 29th, less than 24 hours before 3i Atlas reached perihelion, the joint NASA-ESA communication line officially closed. A short notice was sent out reading, "Heliophysical collaboration temporarily paused pending data verification post-solar conjunction." That line, pending verification, was the last message shared between American and European ground teams before the blackout. China issued its own statement, nearly identical in wording. After that, all transmissions went silent, and so, as the interstellar object curved behind the Sun, invisible to every optical instrument on Earth, the same question rippled through every control room. Who was still watching it? After perihelion, neither country released their data. NASA's solar orbiter listed hardware interference. China's ASOS logged solar flux contamination, but insiders knew that wasn't true. Both had detected something structured, something both sides wanted to understand, alone. The restricted channels that once carried the language of science had transformed into conduits of strategy. And in that new silence, astronomy gave way to espionage. The days leading up to perihelion were supposed to be routine. Astronomers knew that once 3i Atlas slipped behind the solar disk, visual observation would be impossible. The plan, at least the official one, was to collect as much data as possible before the sun's glare swallowed it entirely. Every major solar observatory, from NASA's Parker Solar Probe to China's ASOS and ESA's solar orbiter, had synchronized observation schedules. Telemetry windows were plotted to the second. Spectral bands were pre-selected. The scientific world was poised for a moment of clarity. Instead, they got interference. At precisely 3:12 UTC, October 27th, ground stations in Madrid, Canberra, and Djibouti simultaneously registered a spike across multiple radio frequencies, a burst lasting just over 11 seconds. It wasn't a solar flare. The sun was quiet that morning, with stable X-ray emissions. The anomaly appeared narrowband, centered around 289.4 MHz, and carried an amplitude pattern that repeated at equal intervals, 3 pulses, each separated by 2.7 seconds. Initially, it was dismissed as instrument crosstalk, 2 satellites transmitting in overlapping windows. But the timing didn't match any scheduled operations. Parker was in downlink blackout, Solar Orbiter was on standby, and China's ASOS had not yet begun its perihelion sequence. Something else was transmitting. NASA analysts ran diagnostics and confirmed the burst originated from roughly the same right ascension and declination coordinates as 3i Atlas's predicted position just above the ecliptic plane. The probability of coincidence was small, less than 0.03%, yet the data wasn't clear enough to declare a source. What drew attention wasn't just the signal's location, it was its structure. The waveform contained phase modulations too orderly to be random noise. 3 peaks, identical shape, decaying exponentially in amplitude, an echo of consistency where chaos should reign. When the data reached the control room at the Deep Space Network complex in Goldstone, a systems engineer reportedly muttered, "That's not solar." He was told not to repeat it. Within 12 hours, both the US and China had flagged the event as potential non-natural emission. That phrase, carefully chosen, was the bureaucratic middle ground between artificial signal and instrument glitch. Neither wanted to use the word intelligent. It was easier to say non-natural. But behind closed doors, the discussion was sharper. At Goddard, a classified call between NASA's Director of Heliophysics and the US Space Command was logged under the subject line, Signal Contamination Analysis, Object 3 Secrecy Atlas. In Beijing, a similar meeting convened at the Strategic Support Forces Satellite Operations Center. Both concluded the same thing. The signal was real, it was structured, and it came from the vicinity of 3i Atlas. Both also agreed to say nothing. The following day, October 28th, the anomaly repeated. This time, it lasted 29 seconds. European radio telescopes caught fragments of it before being ordered to halt observation. In those fragments, analysts noticed something else: harmonic sidebands at precise multiples of the base frequency, as if the emission carried internal timing markers. The modulation appeared deliberate. At the SETI Institute, a small group of independent researchers quietly analysed open data from non-classified sources. Their software detected a repeating binary pattern embedded in the amplitude, 101101110101, repeating every 8.6 seconds. It wasn't long enough to carry a message, but it was patterned enough to suggest purpose. When they tried to publish the finding to the public server, the upload failed. Hours later, the repository itself went offline for maintenance. It stayed offline for 3 days. By then, 3I Atlas had already vanished behind the sun. NASA's official narrative framed the bursts as radio frequency interference possibly linked to reflected solar emissions. But internal memos told a different story. One report from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, dated October 29th, summarized: triadic emission events consistent across global receivers. Origin coincides with object vector plus or minus 0.4 degrees. Statistical likelihood of natural origin estimated below 0.2%. Further analysis deferred pending interagency review. The final phrase, interagency review, meant one thing: intelligence oversight. From that point on, 3I Atlas data was no longer handled by scientists alone. It now belonged to the same offices that track missile launches and satellite debris. Meanwhile, on the Chinese side, the ASOS mission detected an infrared flare, faint, brief, but distinct. It appeared roughly 10 minutes after the second radio burst, right as 3I Atlas entered its closest solar approach. The flare lasted 4 seconds, expanding radially before fading. Chinese analysts described it as thermal bloom inconsistent with sublimation. In other words, not melting ice, something else. Possibly an exhaust, a reflection, or a controlled vent. They never said which. A translated excerpt from a DSSB internal log, later leaked by a European journalist, read: "Thermal vector suggests directional impulse. Not symmetrical. Possible controlled trajectory adjustment." It was the first time anyone had written the word controlled in connection to 3I Atlas. The document disappeared within hours. When the object finally passed perihelion on October 29th, it was invisible to every optical telescope on Earth. The sun's glare made direct imaging impossible. But radar stations, particularly Goldstone and FAST, continued sweeping the area. What they found deepened the mystery. Goldstone reported a transient return signal that didn't align with predicted trajectory models. FAST recorded a secondary emission echo, displaced by several arc minutes, as if something had detached or reflected from the primary body. No one could confirm it, but internal estimates suggested that whatever separated was small, perhaps tens of meters across, and moved away at roughly 40 meters per second. A fragment, perhaps, or a probe. By October 30th, both the US and China had taken the same step. Full data lockdown. NASA's internal telemetry servers were restricted to Tier 1 access. China's public ASOS dashboard was replaced by a placeholder message about data recalibration. All communication between international observatories ceased. It wasn't just secrecy anymore, it was strategy. Analysts later found that several ground stations received encrypted update packets routed through military satellites, bypassing civilian networks entirely. The subject lines were simple: SIGINT correlation in progress, signal intelligence, not astronomy. That was the quiet moment when 3I Atlas stopped being a scientific phenomenon and became an intelligence asset. Every piece of data, every photon, every echo was now classified by default. The reactions within the scientific community ranged from disbelief to quiet anger. For many, this was the first time a cosmic discovery had been absorbed into geopolitical infrastructure. Astrophysicists who dedicated careers to open data exchange found themselves signing non-disclosure agreements. Collaborative projects were frozen, preprints were retracted, and every public question about 3I Atlas was met with the same rehearsed response: data under verification. Results forthcoming, but results never came. What did survive? Barely. Were fragments from secondary instruments, independent receivers, unclassified spectrometers, and privately funded satellites. Their raw data revealed that the October 27th to 29th window wasn't just a random emission burst, it was a sequence, a timed progression of events that matched the object's heliocentric velocity profile. In other words, whatever emitted those signals seemed to know exactly where it was and how close it was to the Sun. One private observatory in South Africa, operating outside government control, detected faint polarization flickers matching the radio bursts. When overlaid, the pattern resembled a decaying sine wave with perfect phase alignment, a level of coherence rarely seen in natural plasma environments. The lead researcher wrote in a blog post before it was removed, "It's as if the object spoke, but only when no one was looking." In hindsight, those 3 days, October 27th, 28th and 29th, became known among analysts as the signal window, a narrow slice of time when 3i Atlas was closest to the Sun and furthest from human observation, a window during which something happened that neither side could fully explain or fully admit. Officially, nothing unusual occurred. Unofficially, it triggered one of the largest cross-agency data seizures in modern history. Over 30 terabytes of observational telemetry were moved from scientific archives into defense storage. Access logs vanished, public mirrors were wiped clean, and the few scientists who still had access were told one thing: the data is inconclusive. Yet off the record, those same scientists described something else entirely: coherence, rhythm, and intent. In the end, the signal window didn't just reveal a mystery in the sky, it revealed something deeper, a new kind of Cold War fought not with weapons but with data. Each nation now believed the other might have decoded something they didn't, and in that paranoia, science became surveillance. As one anonymous researcher later summarized, "It's not that they're hiding what it is, it's that they're hiding who understood it first." By the morning of October 30th, the world of astronomy had changed, and hardly anyone noticed. The public feeds that normally display solar and heliospheric telemetry were still online, still updating, still humming with meaningless numbers. But behind those dashboards, behind the illusion of transparency, something monumental had shifted. The real data, the unfiltered high-resolution datasets gathered during the perihelion window, had vanished. Every mission that had eyes on 3i Atlas during its closest approach to the Sun reported temporary archival maintenance. In reality, that phrase meant one thing: lockdown. Inside NASA's Heliophysics division, the order arrived in the early hours, just after 2 a.m. Eastern Time. A short unsigned directive was delivered to the Parker Solar Probe operations team at the Applied Physics Laboratory. It contained only 3 sentences. Suspend non-critical telemetry distribution. Flag all perihelion datasets for Tier 1 clearance. Await review by interagency committee, no explanation, no duration, no source authority. Tier 1 meant eyes only. Data accessible exclusively to defense-cleared personnel under intelligence oversight. In other words, the science team was out of the loop. One senior systems engineer later told a colleague, "We lost the data the moment we captured it." The Chinese ASOS team received a nearly identical order. At 9:47 Beijing time, the National Space Science Center circulated an encrypted notice to its Solar Observation Unit. Perihelion telemetry, classified under Strategic Observation Directive 12, B cross-national data sharing suspended. Reanalysis permitted only under joint supervision with the Strategic Support Force. The wording mirrored the US notice almost perfectly, down to the phrase joint supervision. It was as if both nations had anticipated this moment, rehearsed it even, long before 3i Atlas made its pass. And just like that, the scientific world's access to the object, its light, heat, motion, and composition, was gone. At first, few realized what was happening. Astronomers at independent universities kept requesting datasets through the usual portals. They were met with maintenance messages, redirects, or blank data streams. One researcher from MIT wrote in frustration, "It's like the Sun deleted half its photons." By mid-morning, word began to spread in private astronomy channels. The raw data from Parker and ASOS had been seized. Even calibration files, harmless housekeeping data, were inaccessible. ESA, acting as intermediary, requested a verification copy through standard data sharing protocols. The request was denied. Official reason: ongoing quality assurance. Unofficial reason: security sensitivity. That phrase, security sensitivity, had never before appeared in heliophysics communications. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating that Parker's detectors had picked up unusual line emissions in the ultraviolet and infrared bands. narrow peaks centered on elements that shouldn't have been present in a typical cometary coma: nickel, cobalt, and complex carbonyls. The signature resembled nickel tetracarbonyl, a highly toxic industrial compound used in metal purification and, in some cases, high-efficiency thermal shielding. Such compounds do not exist naturally in cometary outgassing. They form under controlled conditions: factories, refineries, or, in the void of space, engineered processes. Within hours, this detail had reached both intelligence communities, and within hours more, it disappeared from every accessible dataset. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, analysts were told to recalibrate spectral noise parameters, a euphemism for scrubbing the anomaly. At the same time, China's ASOS analysts were instructed to adjust reflectivity models for thermal correction. Both effectively removed the same data points from public graphs. Both claimed the readings were instrumental artifacts. But internal memos told another story. An unverified but credible leak from the US National Reconnaissance Office included a single annotated plot showing a narrow emission peak at 218.1 nanometers, labelled non-natural origin suspected. The comment attached, compound identified as potential organometallic vapor consistent with advanced industrial residue. If authentic, that note would mean one thing: the Parker Solar Probe had detected something that looked manufactured. Within 24 hours, every research paper, forum post, and internal log mentioning nickel tetracarbonyl or industrial signature vanished from public view. The ARXIV preprint repository quietly removed 3 recent uploads with no explanation. A popular Reddit thread analysing ASOS spectral leaks was deleted under legal request. Even university archives were purged, an unprecedented coordination of digital silence. When asked, NASA's Public Affairs Office replied curtly, the probe detected nothing inconsistent with known cometary compositions. But independent analysts noticed that several previously public mission graphs were replaced with JPEGs, static images instead of live data feeds. The metadata of those images revealed editing timestamps matching the same hour the classification orders were issued. It was digital erasure done in real time. Behind closed doors, however, panic was rising. Both the United States and China now possessed what appeared to be physical evidence, chemical traces hinting at industrial origin. Neither could be sure if it was coincidence, contamination, or something else entirely. But neither could risk letting the other get there first. A former intelligence officer familiar with interagency briefings described it bluntly. It wasn't about aliens, it was about ownership of proof. If one side could demonstrate that 3i Atlas was artificial, even partially, it would control not just the narrative, but the future of deep space surveillance. Funding, military doctrine, even public perception would shift overnight. For both nations, it became safer to bury the truth than to lose the upper hand. By November 1st, less than 48 hours after perihelion, international coordination channels were fully dead. The IAU, ESA, JAXA, and ISRO all reported temporary suspension of cooperative data flow. Privately, several directors admitted they'd received quiet phone calls advising them to defer analysis until further notice. Some complied, others saved backups. A few, mostly mid-level analysts and private astronomers, began leaking fragments of the deleted data to encrypted archives. One such leak included partial readings from Parker's ultraviolet spectrometer showing emission spikes corresponding to vaporized nickel. When compared to ASOS data, recovered from a cached mirror, the match was nearly perfect. 2 nations, 2 instruments, 2 readings of the same thing, and both had chosen to hide it. At this point, lockdown became literal. US researchers who had worked on Parker were temporarily reassigned. Chinese teams were relocated to secure internal review zones. Emails went unanswered. Research servers were air-gapped from the internet. It was as if 3i Atlas had never existed, yet whispers persisted. Analysts within both governments began speculating privately. Was this a natural metal vapor plume, or evidence of construction? Could 3i Atlas have been a fragment of something larger? A derelict probe, a remnant of an engineered object that had travelled for eons? No one could say for sure. But the data suggested composition ratios too precise to be random. Nickel to carbon ratios near 1:4, consistent with engineered alloys. For many, that was enough to raise alarms. Publicly, agencies stuck to the script. NASA released a press statement describing the event as a valuable opportunity to study interstellar chemistry. China followed with a statement of its own, almost identical in tone. Neither mentioned the classification orders nor the missing data. But something else began surfacing. Military contracts. The US Space Force quietly allocated emergency funding to the Deep Space Surveillance Expansion Initiative, citing emerging interstellar monitoring requirements. China's Strategic Support Force initiated its own program under the codename Sky Mirror. Both projects were funded within a week of the data lockdown. Both were designed to detect non-gravitational interstellar transients. In essence, the world's two most powerful nations had just redefined 3I Atlas, not as a comet, not as a curiosity, but as a potential contact event. What they didn't realize yet was how fragile that secrecy would become. Too many people had seen too much, and the more each side tried to contain the information, the more suspicious the silence grew. By early November, whispers of whistleblowers began to circulate. Some scientists refused to destroy backups. Others encrypted data caches on personal drives, waiting for the right moment. They knew something the public didn't. That 3I Atlas's chemical fingerprints were not random, that the emission bursts matched a pattern, and that both nations, while pretending ignorance, were already building new protocols to detect more like it. The data was locked away, but the implications couldn't be. The lockdown was meant to preserve control. Instead, it marked the beginning of an intelligence race that no one could fully contain. By November 2nd, the official story had forked. What had once been a shared mystery became a mirror, each side reflecting its own version of truth. In Washington, 3I Atlas was a volatile-rich interstellar body with unique photochemical behavior. In Beijing, it was a possible artificial probe fragment exhibiting signs of deliberate modulation. Same data, two realities, and the space between them became a geopolitical no-man's land. In the United States, NASA moved fast to frame the narrative. Within 48 hours of the data lockdown, a carefully worded press release was drafted and distributed to science journalists. It avoided all mention of radio bursts, spectral emissions, or the nickel signature. Instead, it emphasized solar radiation pressure, volatile outgassing, and dust jets causing apparent non-gravitational acceleration. To the untrained eye, the explanation was convincing, but inside NASA, few believed it. A physicist at the Goddard Space Flight Center described the official report as a political document disguised as a research summary. He explained, off record, the parameters don't match natural outgassing. It's behaving like a sail, not a rock. Another internal email thread showed analysts arguing over the inclusion of the phrase, no evidence of artificial origin. One scientist protested that such a statement required proof. Proof that didn't exist. The phrase stayed anyway. In Washington, denial had become preemption. By insisting early that 3I Atlas was natural, US agencies framed any alternative explanation as conspiracy. It wasn't about science anymore, it was about control of perception. China, however, played a subtler game. Unlike the Americans, they didn't rush to publish. Instead, the Strategic Support Force quietly began circulating internal memos summarizing ASOS data. One document, later leaked through an anonymous academic contact in Hong Kong, summarized the event in careful coded language. Observed object demonstrates atypical emission coherence inconsistent with random natural reflection. Correlation between radio and optical phases suggests engineered synchronization. The key phrase, engineered synchronization, caused ripples across the intelligence community. If authentic, it meant Chinese analysts were leaning toward artificiality, but only internally. Publicly, their scientists maintained restraint. A state-approved journal, Acta Astronomica Sinica, published a short paper describing 3I Atlas as an interstellar body exhibiting organized reflectivity modulation, possibly due to crystalline structure. In other words, an alien mirror hidden in scientific jargon. The differences between the two narratives weren't just linguistic, they were strategic. The American version minimized the anomaly, grounding it in physics. The Chinese version amplified the anomaly, grounding it in curiosity. One wanted to calm the world. The other wanted to signal discovery. Why? Because control over interpretation meant control over who looked deeper. If 3I Atlas was merely a strange comet, then it stayed within NASA's jurisdiction, a scientific curiosity soon forgotten. But if it was something engineered, then it fell under defense intelligence. For China, the latter scenario justified expanding their surveillance infrastructure. For the US, the former avoided admitting they had just lost visual control of an unknown object near the Sun. Behind both facades, though, a quieter conversation was taking place, one that never reached the public. In a secure video meeting between analysts at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and representatives from the US Space Command, someone raised the question directly: if the material signature is synthetic, does that constitute evidence of non-terrestrial manufacture? The response was clinical, almost rehearsed. Classification prohibits assessment of intent or origin. Proceed under natural anomaly framework until confirmation. That phrase, until confirmation, became the new doctrine. It allowed intelligence agencies to study the object under secrecy while scientists maintained plausible deniability. A double narrative, both true enough to coexist. China's internal approach was equally calculated. Satellite logs later revealed that during the days following the perihelion event, the FAST radio telescope conducted a series of narrowband sweeps near the coordinates of 3I Atlas's expected egress. The frequency range matched the October 27th to 29th signal window. These follow-up scans were never made public. But an intercepted summary from a private contractor working on behalf of ESA suggested that FAST detected intermittent residual coherence, faint echoes, perhaps reflections, of the same pulse pattern detected before perihelion. Whether those echoes came from the object or background noise remains unknown. What mattered was interpretation. To Chinese analysts, residual coherence implied lingering transmission, perhaps a decaying beacon. To the Americans, it meant nothing more than solar static. Two sides, two explanations, both impossible to disprove without cooperation, and cooperation had already died. The world's academic community, caught in the crossfire, began fracturing along similar lines. In the West, universities leaned toward NASA's natural origin narrative. They cited peer-reviewed consistency, historical precedent, and Occam's razor. But whispers of censorship persisted. Researchers reported denied access to data, redacted documents, and unexplained funding reassignments. In private chats, they called it the quiet freeze. In China, meanwhile, young astrophysicists whispered the opposite, that they were told not to rule out engineering too quickly. A professor at Tsinghua University under anonymity said, "We were encouraged to stay open-minded, to consider intelligent construction models." When asked if that meant extraterrestrial, he replied simply, "They didn't say no." By mid-November, the divergence had solidified into doctrine. NASA's next bulletin labelled 3I Atlas a volatile-driven, outgassing-dominated interstellar remnant. China's National Space Administration released a technical report using far more cautious phrasing, an object of undetermined structural origin. Both statements were correct in isolation. Together, they were mutually exclusive. The Chinese version was carefully vague. Too vague to dismiss, too bold to ignore. It signalled something subtle to the world. We think there's more. And that was enough to force Washington to double down. The US Department of Defense began issuing quiet denials through proxy scientists, funding a wave of papers reinforcing the natural body explanation. A review in Nature Astronomy summarized 3I Atlas as a volatile-rich comet exhibiting asymmetric sublimation jets. No author mentioned that those jets appeared to align perfectly with the object's velocity vector, an orientation statistically unlikely for a random body. The omission wasn't accidental, it was protective. By now, the intelligence communities on both sides were heavily involved. US analysts began examining how China's scientific narrative might be signalling intent, a way of hinting to the world that they had captured something more, without saying so outright. Chinese strategists, in turn, viewed the US downplaying as cover, evidence that they were sitting on proof of artificiality. A strange symmetry emerged. Each side believed the other was hiding confirmation, and that belief drove both toward escalation. In early November, US military radar assets under the Deep Space Network began round-the-clock tracking of 3I Atlas's outbound trajectory. A week later, China announced an expansion of its own deep space tracking capability, with new facilities in Qinghai and Inner Mongolia. Both claimed scientific motives, neither were purely scientific. Outside the geopolitical theatre, a few independent voices tried to stay objective. One of them was Dr. Anya Rostov, a Russian astrophysicist unaffiliated with either side. Her analysis, published quietly in a small Czech journal, proposed a middle ground, that 3I Atlas could be a fragment of a larger interstellar object, possibly artificial, but long defunct. Her conclusion was cautious. If artificial, it is no longer operational. Its emissions may represent decaying resonance rather than communication. That paper was cited by both camps, China to support engineered origin and the US to argue no intelligent control. In a world of binary narratives, even neutrality became propaganda. As November deepened, the split reached absurd levels. Every press release, every academic mention, every mission briefing carried subtle linguistic warfare. Natural, engineered, unknown, anomaly, artifact. Words became weapons, and through that semantic fog the real question was lost. Not what 3I Atlas was, but why its data scared them so much. Inside intelligence circles the answer was obvious. If the object was artificial, it meant someone or saw something had reached us first. If it was natural, its behaviour still implied forces we didn't understand. Either way, it proved how little control we had. And control was the one thing both nations refused to surrender. The competing theories weren't about truth. They were camouflage. Narratives built not to inform but to buy time. Time to analyse, to replicate, to test. Both nations knew that 3I Atlas had left them something, a trail of data pointing toward an intelligence neither could confirm nor deny. And as they debated in the open, they were already preparing in the shadows, mobilising research teams, developing new satellites, scanning the deep sky for the next anomaly. Because one truth had become undeniable. Whatever 3I Atlas was, it had changed the rules, and both sides wanted to be ready before the next one arrived. By the evening of November 1st, 2025, something unusual had started to ripple quietly through the scientific network still tracking 3I Atlas. The public channels, NASA, ESA, CNSA, were calm, polished, controlled. But behind those walls, among analysts and engineers bound by clearance and silence, a different conversation was unfolding. The kind that doesn't appear in press briefings, the kind that spreads through encrypted group calls at 2 a.m. It was about a line, a single, narrow emission line, faint, persistent, and impossible to explain. When the Parker Solar Probe completed its perihelion pass on October 29th, it captured thousands of spectral frames of 3I Atlases surrounding Coma. Most showed what everyone expected: carbon dioxide, dust, trace sodium. But buried deep within the ultraviolet range was an emission peak that didn't fit any known cometry pattern. The wavelength was 218.1 nanometers, the exact fingerprint of nickel tetracarbonyl. The discovery should have been routine. Unexplained spectral features appear in comet studies all the time. But nickel tetracarbonyl is not a natural compound. It's a synthetic gas. Colourless, deadly, and almost absurdly difficult to form outside controlled industrial conditions. It requires a precise temperature range, a stable carbon monoxide atmosphere, and refined nickel vapour. Conditions that do not and cannot exist in interstellar space. At Goddard Space Flight Center, when analysts ran the first calibration checks, they assumed it was an error, a false positive. Maybe solar interference, maybe an internal reflection. But the signal didn't disappear. It reappeared in multiple frames, across separate sensors, with consistent amplitude. An internal note circulated among the Parker mission team read simply, "Emission persistent. Origin unknown. Not consistent with instrument noise." That short line started a chain reaction inside NASA's hierarchy. The memo was escalated from the Heliophysics Division to the Office of Planetary Protection, and then upward again to the Defense Intelligence Directorate. The data was quietly sealed under Tier 1 clearance. For scientists, that meant one thing. Their discovery had just left the domain of research and entered the territory of national security. Across the Pacific, the same thing was happening in mirror image. The Advanced Space-Based Solar Observatory, SOS, had also recorded high-resolution spectrographs of 3I Atlas during perihelion. Their data too contained the same spectral anomaly, a faint ultraviolet line where none should exist. When Chinese scientists at the Purple Mountain Observatory compared it against Parker's published models, the pattern aligned almost perfectly. For about 12 hours, internal discussion was open. Then, on the morning of October 31st, a directive arrived from the Strategic Support Force. Suspend dissemination of perihelion spectral data pending state review. Priority classification, Level 3, Strategic Material Anomaly. Level 3 was not for comets. It was for weapons tests and foreign intelligence incidents. Within a day, both nations had reached the same conclusion, separately and secretly. They had detected something that looked engineered, something metallic, something that wasn't supposed to be there. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, analysts began reprocessing the ultraviolet data to isolate background contamination. One report noted that removing solar interference only strengthened the anomaly's visibility. The line was clean, narrow, deliberate. In Beijing, chemical modelling teams attempted to simulate the formation of nickel tetracarbonyl under comet-like conditions. The results failed. No natural model could reproduce the ratio of nickel to carbon monoxide seen in the data. The only viable explanation required an artificial catalyst, a process involving controlled temperature and pressure, a laboratory process. By November 1st, the term industrial signature began to circulate quietly within both agencies, not in public reports, but in whispered conversations. It wasn't meant to imply intelligence, or contact, or anything sensational. It was just a term, and an uncomfortable one, to describe something that looked manufactured. The European Space Agency, which still maintained partial telemetry relays through its Madrid Deep Space Network node, caught wind of the anomaly through unencrypted packet transfers. Their scientists confirmed the same ultraviolet feature in independent datasets. A confidential note from ESA's spectroscopy division summarized it bluntly. Metallic vapor signature consistent across instruments. Possibility of industrial residue cannot be dismissed. That sentence, buried in an internal PDF, was enough to change the atmosphere across observatories worldwide. Then came the leaks. On encrypted research forums, snippets of spectral plots began appearing. Low-resolution images allegedly pulled from pre-lockdown Parker data. The graphs showed the same 218.1 nanometer spike, annotated with one word, NiCO4. The posts vanished within hours, deleted under legal compliance, but their brief appearance was enough to spark speculation among independent scientists. A few researchers publicly questioned the deletions. One astrophysicist in Italy tweeted, "If this was solar interference, why is everyone treating it like classified intelligence?" Her account was suspended later that day. In Washington, senior officials began to worry about containment. If the nickel tetracarbonyl line was real, and if it reached the press, it could reignite public fascination with the artificial object theory that had haunted Oumuamua years earlier. This time, however, the evidence would be chemical, not visual, and chemistry was harder to explain away. The order came down quickly. All references to nickel tetracarbonyl were to be scrubbed from documentation. The term would be replaced by volatile metal-carbon complex. A NASA spokesperson rehearsed the official phrasing, "The object displays a transient emission pattern, possibly due to unstable volatiles near perihelion." It was technically accurate, and completely misleading. China handled it differently. Rather than deny the finding, they folded it into a broader narrative of unknown phenomena. Their state-run science outlets mentioned unusual metallic vapor emissions in a single article that vanished within a day. But the phrasing was deliberate, enough to hint, not enough to reveal. Privately, Chinese intelligence analysts were already developing scenarios to explain it. One internal report speculated that 3I Atlas might be a fragment of a long-dead interstellar vessel, a remnant that had drifted for eons before breaking apart near the Sun. The theory was speculative, even romantic. But for the first time, someone in an official setting had called it by a new term, technological debris. Among scientists still following the story, emotions were mixed: fascination, fear, resignation. A researcher at Caltech described it as the day science stopped being public. Another said quietly, "We found the smoking gun, and they buried it before we could even argue about it." But not everyone stayed silent. Some scientists refused to delete their local backups. Others encrypted copies of the spectral data and stored them in cold drives, labelled innocuously as calibration archives. In academic circles, the phrase industrial residue became a whispered password, a reminder of what was seen and immediately hidden. The implications of the finding were staggering. If the readings were accurate, then 3i Atlas contained processed metal compounds, refined alloys, not raw ore. That would make it the first known object of its kind. Not built recently, not active, but assembled somewhere, sometime, by someone. It could be millions of years old, or billions. Whatever it was, it had endured a journey across interstellar space, and it had survived a pass around the sun without disintegrating. The idea wasn't that it was a spacecraft still functioning. The idea was that it had once been something, and the universe had delivered its wreckage to our doorstep. None of this has been confirmed publicly. No official statement mentions nickel tetracarbonyl or industrial residue or artifact hypotheses. To the world, 3i Atlas remains a comet, bright, volatile, unpredictable. But to those who've seen the unredacted data, the story has changed. The mystery isn't whether it's natural, it's how much of it isn't. And somewhere, between two nations locked in quiet competition, the truth sits encrypted, locked behind clearance codes, waiting for a time when science and secrecy no longer share the same orbit. By November 1st, 2025, 3i Atlas had already passed behind the Sun, leaving astronomers waiting for its reappearance on the outbound leg. For weeks, orbital models had been clear and stable, a hyperbolic trajectory, steep, fast, predictable. It was supposed to emerge again near the ecliptic plane, faint, elongated and steadily dimming. But when the first post-perihelion radar returns arrived, something didn't fit. The object wasn't where it should have been. At the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex in California, analysts reviewing the early data noticed a subtle offset, barely measurable, but real. Instead of following the expected path defined by pre-perihelion parameters, 3i Atlas appeared to be trailing slightly inward, closer to the Sun's gravitational line than predicted. The deviation measured just 0.06 degrees off-axis. In celestial terms, that's tiny. But to orbital dynamics experts, it's everything. The first thought was radiation pressure, the same subtle push that had once caused controversy over Oumuamua, but the math didn't add up. The change wasn't random drift. It was clean, directional, and almost timed. A propulsion impulse that's small could have come from a symmetric outgassing, sure. Gas jets firing unevenly as frozen volatiles sublimated under solar heat. But 3i Atlas wasn't showing any new jets. In fact, post-perihelion photometry showed it was less active than before. The comet had quieted, even as its path changed. At first, the anomaly was ignored. Data noise, they said. A measurement error, maybe a calibration mismatch between radar stations. But by the afternoon of October 31st, multiple tracking networks, Goldstone in the US, FAST in China, and ESA's ESTRAC station in Cebreros, Spain, were reporting the same offset. 3 independent measurements, same direction, same amplitude. The object had drifted. Inside US Space Command, the finding triggered an emergency meeting. Classified minutes from that session, later leaked through an internal whistleblower, described it in stark language. Observed deviation in post-perihelion vector, inconsistent with gravitational and radiative models. Probable impulse event occurred between October 29, 1900 UTC and October 30, 300 UTC. Magnitude suggests mass redistribution or controlled acceleration. The phrase controlled acceleration was circled in red in the margin. In Beijing, the Strategic Support Force reached the same conclusion, though their terminology was different. Their internal report described it as a non-ballistic motion adjustment. In plain terms, something about the object's behavior didn't match the laws of passive motion. According to ASOS thermal data, the temperature of the object's leading edge had remained stable during perihelion. Too stable. Natural comets flare and cool erratically as they pass the Sun. 3i Atlas hadn't. It absorbed heat as if its surface was protected, then shed that heat at a rate inconsistent with its mass and velocity. A thermal curve that flat meant only two things: an unprecedented natural phenomenon or engineered insulation. Both explanations were unpalatable. The deviation was small, yes, but its implications were enormous. If it was natural, it meant something about solar physics was still misunderstood. If it wasn't, it meant the object was capable of motion control, even subtle correction, deep inside a gravitational field where no human spacecraft could survive. That possibility, however remote, could not be ignored. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Orbital engineers re-ran the trajectory models using updated radar data. The results were consistent across every simulation. The object had slightly increased its heliocentric velocity. Not enough to escape notice, but enough to violate Newtonian expectations. It was as if 3i Atlas had leaned, gently, deliberately, away from the Sun. The phrase orbital drift began appearing in restricted memos within both space agencies. It wasn't officially recognized yet. But inside technical circles, it had already become shorthand for what everyone feared, that the object's motion wasn't random. In Washington, the Defense Intelligence Agency requested that the Goldstone radar logs be transferred to a secured database, accessible only through classified terminals. The same order instructed all ground stations to cease sharing positional updates with the European Space Agency. Until confirmation, the memo said, the same phrase that had followed every unexplained anomaly so far. Across the ocean, China quietly did the same. Their Changchun tracking station stopped transmitting real-time coordinates to the global astronomical network, claiming temporary calibration issues. The truth was simpler. They wanted exclusive observation time. By late night on November 1st, the data situation had turned opaque again. Public orbital plots remained unchanged. They still showed a stable hyperbolic path. But classified models circulating between US and Chinese intelligence units painted a different picture. 3i Atlas's outbound trajectory wasn't perfectly straight. It was bending slightly, as if following an invisible corridor through space. That corridor, according to internal estimates, would bring it within 0.02 astronomical units of Venus's orbital plane in mid-December. Close enough for a second round of observations, but only if someone could track it without interference. In both nations, that realization triggered a scramble. Whoever could maintain contact with 3i Atlas first, optical, radar or otherwise, would own the post-perihelion data, and with that data came leverage. NASA's Solar Orbiter Coordination Office extended its tracking windows. The US Air Force allocated additional deep space radar sweeps for orbital confirmation. Meanwhile, Chinese Defense Command redirected a portion of their Skywave array toward the same sector, operating under what insiders later described as military-level secrecy. It was no longer about science. It was a race to keep the signal alive. Among scientists, reactions varied from disbelief to dread. The public explanation, asymmetric outgassing, didn't hold up. The shape of the deviation didn't match gas jets or rotational torque. It matched impulse. Dr. Elaine McCready, a veteran orbital analyst working under contract for ESA, described it privately to colleagues as not propulsion in the classic sense, more like guidance, something maintaining course integrity. Her notes were never published. The following week, she was reassigned to another mission at the European Space Operations Centre, ESOC. Telemetry archivists noticed something odd in the post-perihelion packet timestamps, a gap of exactly 11 minutes between the last signal before perihelion and the first confirmed return signal afterward. That gap, they said, didn't match any scheduled blackout window. It was as if the object itself had gone silent, deliberately, before re-emerging on the other side. When cross-checked against the radio bursts detected between October 27th and 29th, the timing aligned almost perfectly. If those emissions had been deliberate, the pause might not have been coincidence. It might have been a maneuver. Inside the Pentagon's Space Analysis Division, that theory gained traction. A report labelled confidential/SCI, not for public release, summarised, observed deviation in post-perihelion path coincides with period of prior radio emission events. Correlation probability greater than 95%. Object behaviour suggests residual or autonomous propulsion signature. Autonomous propulsion. It was the first time anyone had used that phrase in an official capacity. The report never left the room, but word of it spread anyway, whispered, paraphrased, disbelieved, and feared. For now, no one outside the classified loop knows where 3i Atlas truly is. The public orbital models remain steady, the official tone calm, but inside defense circles, calculations are ongoing, comparisons repeating endlessly. Every new radar echo measured, every deviation logged. The object hasn't spoken again, at least not in any detectable frequency. But its path, that quiet, deliberate curve, has left analysts wondering if silence itself might be a kind of communication. Something once drifting has changed its course, and no one, on either side of the world, is sure whether it's still moving by chance or by choice. The night sky is supposed to be neutral. For centuries it was the one frontier where borders dissolved, a shared map without flags. But after the orbital drift of Three-Eye Atlas became evident that neutrality shattered. In less than 48 hours, telescopes that once cooperated began competing. Every dish, every radar, every antenna that could point toward the ecliptic suddenly mattered. The race was no longer about discovery, it was about custody. On November 2nd, at 300 hours UTC, the Goldstone Deep Space Network, DSM in California, received authorization for continuous tracking of Three-Eye Atlas's outbound vector. Normally, such an allocation would be shared, NASA, ESA, and the international community pooling resources. This time, the clearance came through US Space Command, not the usual civilian channels. The mission code attached to the order, DSN-93A, Surveillance Continuity. The Goldstone team was instructed to treat the operation as a targeted reflection study, language borrowed from asteroid tracking. But the classified section of the brief was more direct. Object exhibits potential for active maneuvering. Maintain uninterrupted radar contact. Do not share data beyond Tier 1 clearance. In other words, the world's most powerful radar telescope had just been reassigned from space science to counterintelligence. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, a parallel operation was unfolding. China's 500-meter aperture spherical telescope, FAST, had also received new instructions from the Strategic Support Force. Switch from pulsar monitoring to dynamic tracking of trans-solar trajectories. The object was never named in official logs, but the timeframes matched exactly with Three-Eye Atlas's predicted re-emergence. FAST's civilian researchers were abruptly told their observing windows were postponed due to calibration maintenance. Yet local staff noticed something odd. The dish was pointed unusually low, scanning along the ecliptic for several hours at a time, long past scheduled breaks. One technician described it quietly to a journalist before his statement disappeared online. "We were told it's a comet, but they're watching it like an enemy satellite within a day." Two of the largest radar systems on Earth, separated by ideology, united by fear, were staring at the same spot in the sky, and neither side was talking. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, command logs show a string of encrypted pings labelled phase echo. These correspond to active radar pulses, tight, narrow bursts designed to measure the time delay between emission and reflection. The data that came back was messy, scattered, inconsistent, but hidden in the noise was a repeating pattern. 3 faint echoes spaced evenly apart, each returning slightly out of phase. That's not what natural bodies do. Dust clouds scatter, rocks reflect randomly. This was structured, like a shape with geometry. When JPL analysts tried to publish a summary for internal review, the document was flagged for reclassification. The project lead was informed the object had been designated a strategic foreign observation target. China's FAST network returned similar results. Their reports mention anomalous backscatter intervals, faint but periodic, occurring every 6.2 seconds. The frequency matched almost perfectly with the 3-pulse signal sequence recorded before perihelion. In intelligence terms, that's called a signature lock, when 2 independent sensors detect the same repeating pattern. In espionage terms, it's confirmation. Europe, caught between the 2 giants, tried to stay neutral. The European Space Agency, ESA, offered to serve as mediator, proposing a joint radar tracking campaign using Spain's Cebreros and Argentina's Malag stations. Both nations ignored the offer. Instead, Washington warned its allies that foreign signal leaks may compromise national interests. Beijing echoed that warning internally, telling its agencies that foreign cooperation on this object is premature. By November 3rd, Europe was locked out. Their radar screens went dark. Inside intelligence offices, analysts began talking about a new term, space custody. It wasn't about ownership in the legal sense. It was about control of observation, the ability to decide who sees what and when. If one side could maintain constant tracking while the other couldn't, they effectively owned the narrative. The Americans, with Goldstone and the DSN network, held the advantage in reach. The Chinese, with FAST's immense sensitivity, held the advantage in precision. Each was watching from a different angle, both convinced the other had data they didn't. And in that paranoia, the tracking war began. It started quietly. The US issued new transmission schedules, pushing radar pings closer together, an attempt to refine measurements. China noticed and adjusted fast sweep intervals in near real time. Both began transmitting radar signals at slightly offset frequencies, effectively jamming each other's reflections through interference. Neither side acknowledged it, but the interference patterns were visible in their own data. To outside observers, it looked like noise. To those on the inside, it was electronic competition, two nations blinding each other in the name of precision. As the hours turned into days, the global astronomy community found itself frozen out. Requests for 3 iAtlas coordinates went unanswered. Online repositories that used to share updated ephemerides suddenly returned restricted access. Ground telescopes relying on those coordinates began missing the object entirely. One frustrated astronomer from Chile wrote anonymously, "It's not lost, it's hidden." By November 4th, the phrase "hidden comet" was trending on private research boards. A joke that didn't feel funny. Behind closed doors, analysts tried to piece together what the object's new trajectory meant. If the deviation continued, 3I Atlas would soon move beyond radar range and fade into interstellar space once more. But if it could adjust its path, even slightly, then the story wasn't over. For the Pentagon, that possibility triggered contingency planning. A classified directive instructed surveillance satellites to monitor any correlated near-solar movement patterns. In plain language, look for anything else out there. Fragments, reflections, companions. China's response mirrored it almost exactly. Their Defense Intelligence Agency ordered proximity analysis for multi-object correlation. They too were looking for companions. If 3I Atlas wasn't alone, then both sides wanted to know before the other did. The media, kept in the dark, began speculating in the gaps left behind. Some outlets described classified solar research and national security discoveries. Others floated rumours of a second object, or a metallic core. NASA's Public Affairs Office denied all of it, insisting there was no evidence of active motion or structure. Yet independent analysts who compared open radar sweeps from October 28th to November 1st noticed subtle changes in the echo patterns, consistent with a rotating or shifting surface. It was enough to fuel suspicion that the silence was deliberate. As tension built, the few scientists still with partial access grew uneasy. A radar technician from Madrid, speaking under anonymity, said, "We used to study stars together. Now we're spying on them." That sentiment echoed across research circles. The collaboration that had defined modern astronomy, shared data, open archives, joint missions, was gone. What replaced it looked like the Cold War, but quieter, colder, more precise. Every ping across space was now a move in a game no one admitted playing. For the governments, though, the secrecy served a purpose. By monopolizing access to 3I Atlas, they also controlled what humanity could believe about it. If the object truly adjusted its orbit, even slightly, then both sides could claim it was still active, still mysterious, still valuable. And that gave them reason to keep watching. Each believed they were safeguarding national interests. Each feared the other was deciphering something hidden in the data. Neither realized they were drawing the same conclusions. Tonight, as radar stations hum quietly across the globe, the object is still being tracked. The signals bouncing off its faint metallic surface travel millions of kilometers before whispering back to Earth. Faint, delayed, encrypted in noise. Each nation decodes those whispers differently. But the sound is the same. A steady rhythm in the static, reminding both sides that the object hasn't stopped moving, and neither have they. The sky has become contested ground, and 3I Atlas, once a symbol of interstellar wonder, is now a shadow war in orbit. In the days since 3I Atlas reappeared from behind the sun, the silence has grown more deliberate. Officially, the object is fading from observation. Unofficially, the data streams tell a different story, one so sensitive that even its metadata is now classified. Somewhere between radar pings and encrypted archives, fragments of truth began slipping out. And those fragments reveal something striking. Neither Washington nor Beijing believes this object is inert. The first leak appeared on November 3rd, a brief extract from a US Space Command intelligence bulletin, circulated to select contractors with space object surveillance clearance. The summary line was almost casual. 3I-25 exhibits energy reflection profiles inconsistent with non-conductive surfaces. For anyone outside the field, that would sound meaningless, but to radar engineers it was a red flag. It implied that the object's surface wasn't behaving like rock, ice, or dust, it was conducting. The report went further, describing electromagnetic impedance behaviour consistent with metallic composites. That single sentence, metallic composites, was the clearest internal admission yet that 3I Atlas was not behaving like a comet. The second leak came from the other side of the world. A classified Chinese Strategic Support Force briefing, translated by intelligence analysts in Taiwan, described 3I Atlas as a potential passive receptor exhibiting anomalous signal absorption patterns during perihelion monitoring passive receptor. Those two words changed everything. They suggested that inside Chinese intelligence circles, some believed the object wasn't emitting, it was listening. The briefing claimed ASOs had recorded frequency damping near radar transmission harmonics, meaning 3I Atlas was selectively absorbing certain radio wavelength, as if tuned to them. In their analysis, the pattern couldn't be explained by ordinary material resonance. It looked selective. The phrase at the end of the document, translated directly, read, "Possibility of designed resonance cannot be excluded." Within 48 hours, a corresponding document surfaced from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, marked NOFR, not for foreign dissemination. The summary was terse. Observed post-perihelion modulation indicates partial polarization alignment, unclear if naturally induced. Recommend continued monitoring with classified radar filters. The implication was unmistakable. They had found polarization alignment, electromagnetic order in the reflected signals, a kind of coherence that doesn't occur in random mineral surfaces. If true, it meant something about 3I Atlas's outer shell was reacting, subtly, intelligently, to incoming waves. By November 4th, both nations had reached a quiet consensus. The object was not only unusual, it might be interacting. Not broadcasting, not communicating, but reacting. As if part of it could sense when it was being observed. The leaks that followed deepened that suspicion. One came from a US National Reconnaissance Office NRO memo titled Reflectivity Anomaly 3IA-TLAS. It included an analysis of radar pings from the Goldstone complex. The document described a patterned delay sequence, time intervals between sent and received pulses that shifted slightly every few minutes, following a cycle of approximately 33 minutes. According to the analysts, this wasn't caused by distance, spin, or plasma interference. It was as if the surface reflectivity was being modulated in real time. The memo's final paragraph, heavily redacted, left only one legible line. Pattern periodicity suggests active modulation or adaptive surface behavior. In Beijing, the leaked Chinese counterpart painted a mirror image of the same phenomenon. Their internal study, titled Echo Variance in Object 3I-2025, described radar reflections that adapted in amplitude with incoming signal strength. The analysis proposed an unsettling hypothesis. Possible passive sensor array responding to incident energy, behavior consistent with autonomous material resonance. Translated bluntly, they believed the object's surface was listening to radar waves, learning their rhythm and adjusting its responses. Neither side shared these findings openly, but through private intelligence channels, and perhaps through quiet espionage, both soon became aware that the other had noticed the same thing, and that realization transformed scientific rivalry into strategic fear. In Washington, a small working group was convened inside the Defense Intelligence Directorate, codenamed Hermes, High Energy Reflectivity Monitoring and Emission Study. Its objective was not to prove artificiality, but to determine whether 3I Atlas posed a surveillance risk. The logic was simple. If the object could absorb and re-emit electromagnetic energy, even passively, it could theoretically record it. The lead analyst summarized it starkly. We must consider the possibility that the object functions as a natural recorder, or a constructed one. It was speculation, yes, but informed speculation, and it was enough to move the program under classified status. China's internal response was equally swift. Their Strategic Support Force reactivated a dormant intelligence cell under the codename Qingting, Mandarin for dragonfly. Its task was to model 3I Atlas's electromagnetic cross-section behaviors and assess whether the object could retain or reflect signal data. Dragonflies, in Chinese folklore, symbolize perception, the ability to see what others miss. The name was chosen deliberately. Within days, the cell concluded that the object's selective absorption profile could indicate a composite outer layer, possibly a metamaterial surface capable of filtering wavelengths. One line from the report stood out: "If natural, it is unprecedented. If artificial, it is observing." The leaks didn't stop there. A third document, traced to a contractor at the European Space Agency, summarized intelligence briefings received from both sides. ESA's analyst called the situation a new class of anomaly, noting that for the first time in history, radar reflections from an interstellar object were being treated as intelligence data, not scientific evidence. The tone of the memo was quietly alarmed. "We are observing the militarization of deep space." 3i Atlas has become a test case for how quickly science can be absorbed by state secrecy. By November 5th, independent astronomers began noticing a strange pattern of their own. Public radar pings from both Goldstone and FAST stopped syncing to their usual online logs. The timestamps were missing, as if both networks were deliberately misaligning their transmissions to prevent third-party reconstruction of the object's echo signature. The sky, once a shared archive, had become a digital battlefield. Inside classified circles, analysts now talk about 3i Atlas not as a comet, but as a foreign sensor, origin unknown, purpose uncertain. Some believe it's simply reactive debris, a remnant of advanced material that responds to energy automatically. Others whisper that it's an artifact, still functioning in some limited way, recording everything that touches it: light, radiation, radar. And both sides fear the same thing. If it is recording, what happens when it sends something back? As of tonight, no further emissions have been confirmed. But neither nation has relaxed its posture. Goldstone continues its quiet radar sweeps under Hermes' oversight. FAST maintains its low-frequency scans under Qingting. The two telescopes now stare at the same empty patch of space, their signals crossing invisibly somewhere between Earth and the fading trail of 3i Atlas. In that thin intersection, a question remains suspended, silent, unanswerable, and shared by both nations. Are we tracking it, or is it tracking us? In the days following the classified leaks, the tone inside global research networks began to change. No single event triggered the rupture. It wasn't an announcement, or a public scandal, or a revelation of alien origin. It was subtler, the quiet awareness that everyone was being watched, and no one could speak freely anymore. By November 6th, 2025, 3i Atlas had become less a scientific object and more a geopolitical symbol, an invisible border drawn through space itself. And on both sides of that border, scientists began choosing allegiance over evidence. The first fracture appeared in Europe. The European Space Agency, long accustomed to open data exchanges with NASA, suddenly found itself facing classified refusals. Requests for raw radar telemetry were denied. The Goldstone facility cited national compliance regulations. An internal ESA memo, later leaked to Der Spiegel, summarized the problem succinctly. Our American counterparts no longer distinguish between scientific data and strategic data. The distinction has collapsed. That memo circulated through every major observatory in Europe within 24 hours. By the next morning, an unspoken divide had formed, those still willing to cooperate with NASA and those quietly aligning with the independent bloc led by France, Germany and Spain. In those nations, new research groups began forming under the term observatoires neutres, neutral observatories. Their stated goal was to rebuild transparency. Their unstated fear was being cut off completely. The fracture deepened further when Chinese state media released a short cryptic statement from the National Space Administration. Due to recent international interference, our observations of 3i/ATLAS will continue independently to ensure data integrity. Data integrity, a diplomatic phrase for autonomy. It was a public signal that China would not share anything more. Within hours, all their data portals went dark. At the same time, NASA quietly revoked external access to its deep space network archives. Foreign researchers who once had full permissions suddenly received login errors. Even the International Astronomical Union's internal chat channels were locked for temporary moderation. The walls were rising on every continent. Inside the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, a meeting turned confrontational when junior researchers demanded to know why their work on 3I Atlas had been retracted from e-archive. Their supervisor, an older astrophysicist who'd worked under defense contracts before, answered with brutal honesty, because the word nickel appeared in the abstract. It wasn't censorship in the old sense, it was self-preservation. Every scientist knew that certain phrases now acted like tripwires: nickel tetracarbonyl, non-ballistic motion, polarization alignment, industrial signature. Use any of them in a public paper and your access could vanish overnight. The fear wasn't misplaced. Within a week, 4 astronomers, 2 in the United States, 1 in Germany, 1 in Australia, had their research credentials temporarily suspended pending data integrity review. All 4 had been studying 3I Atlas. All 4 were silenced. At the Purple Mountain Observatory in Nanjing, the same paranoia played out in reverse. Young researchers noticed that their data was being selectively filtered before they saw it. When they compared their plots to unfiltered European backups, entire signal bands were missing, the same ones associated with radar echo fluctuations. One scientist complained privately that their observations were being rewritten to fit the story. That story, the official Chinese narrative, described 3I Atlas as a rare interstellar volatile body with unique reflective dynamics. Every part of that phrase was chosen to sound scientific while removing anything controversial. No mention of metals, no mention of drift, no mention of modulation. It was state science by design. The irony was bitter. Both sides had now adopted each other's methods. The Americans classified what they didn't want challenged. The Chinese sanitized what they didn't want questioned. The result was the same: silence dressed as certainty. The middle ground, the place where scientists once compared and corrected one another, simply disappeared. Among independent astronomers, frustration turned to quiet rebellion. A coalition of small observatories in Chile, Namibia and the Canary Islands began exchanging 3I Atlas data through encrypted peer-to-peer channels. They called themselves the Continuum, an informal alliance of researchers determined to keep open science alive. Their network operated anonymously, under digital pseudonyms. Every night they pooled telescope time and shared their readings. Every morning they risked deletion. Their unofficial statement read, "If governments will not share the sky, we will." The Continuum's early datasets confirmed much of what the classified reports had implied. The object's outbound trajectory remained subtly unstable, and faint radar echoes continued to show a recurring pattern. But their findings never reached the public. One of their data servers was seized in Lisbon under a national security order. The next night their cloud repository vanished. Only a handful of encrypted backups survived, hidden, passed hand to hand on solid-state drives. At academic conferences the shift in tone was unmistakable. Papers on 3I Atlas were discussed in whispers, if at all. Panels about interstellar bodies opened with disclaimers about data uncertainty and lack of access. Even the normally diplomatic language of space science, cautious, understated, began to carry undertones of accusation. European researchers accused NASA of strategic suppression. American scientists accused China of data manipulation. China accused everyone else of politicizing discovery. No one admitted that all 3 were right. One scientist from the Max Planck Institute described the atmosphere bluntly in an internal email. "It's 1958 again, but the rockets are telescopes." He was referring to the Cold War, when space first became a theatre for rivalry instead of cooperation. Except this time, the battleground wasn't orbit, it was truth itself. Inside the intelligence community, officials watched the scientific fallout with quiet satisfaction. The collapse of open data meant tighter control. Every closed network became a gate, and every gate had guards. It was, in their view, an acceptable cost, yet not everyone agreed. A small number of policymakers, in both Washington and Beijing, began to voice concern. If secrecy continued unchecked, it could cripple humanity's ability to respond should 3I Atlas, or anything like it, ever return. But those voices were drowned out by the prevailing logic. National advantage first, collective understanding second. By November 7th, the fracture had solidified into 2 camps. On one side, the scientific bloc, led quietly by ESA and independent observatories, arguing for open verification and peer review. On the other, the strategic bloc, led by the US and China, prioritizing security, control, and proprietary data access. Between them lay the grey zone, the world's remaining scientists drifting between collaboration and compliance, trying to study the universe without being owned by it. When historians one day look back, if the data ever becomes public, they'll see this as the moment astronomy stopped being universal. The stars didn't change, the sky didn't close, humans did. 3i Atlas had revealed something deeper than a possible artificial object. It revealed how fragile cooperation truly was, how easily wonder could be weaponized, and how quickly truth could be divided. For centuries, the cosmos had united humanity in curiosity. Now it had become the perfect mirror of our mistrust. And in that mirror, each nation stared at the same object, seeing not discovery, but danger. By November 8th, 2025, the silence had already turned into strategy. The scientific world might have fractured, but for intelligence agencies and defense ministries, 3i Atlas had created something else: opportunity. An anomaly this precise, this enigmatic, couldn't simply vanish without leaving its mark on policy. And the mark it left was money. Budgets began to rise in places no one had expected: radar infrastructure, sensor networks, orbital reconnaissance. The language used to justify it was vague: solar system surveillance, space situational awareness, non-gravitational trajectory monitoring. But within those innocuous phrases lay the truth. Both the United States and China were quietly preparing for the next one. In Washington, the transformation started within days of the perihelion blackout. An emergency meeting convened at the National Space Council brought together representatives from NASA, the Pentagon, the Department of Energy, and the newly expanded US Space Force. The agenda was concise. One line, written in all caps: 3i/ATLASAFTERMATH FUTUREPROTOCOLS. According to leaked minutes, the discussion quickly turned from science to security. The Space Force proposed a new mission class called Orbital Custody Assets, high-power radar satellites stationed at Lagrange points, designed to detect and track hyperbolic intruders long before they reach the inner solar system. NASA hesitated, warning that such militarization could erode global trust. But the Pentagon's counter-argument was blunt. We can't afford to wait for cooperation. The sky's already contested within a week. Funding for deep space radar expansion was approved. $6.4 billion diverted from unrelated programs and funneled into Project Sentinel, its stated goal: continuous monitoring of interstellar ingress routes. Its unstated one: first rights to discovery. China responded in kind. On November 9th, the State Council for Science and Technology convened its own emergency session in Beijing, co-chaired by senior officials from the Strategic Support Force and CNSA. Their focus mirrored Washington's: autonomous detection, rapid analysis, and signal containment. They called their initiative Tianyan-2, Sky-Eye 2. The existing fast radio telescope was already the most sensitive instrument on Earth, but it was fixed, immobile, predictable. Tianyan-2 would be different, a fleet of smaller steerable dishes connected by laser relay satellites, forming a massive distributed array. Officially, it was a civilian scientific expansion. Unofficially, it was designed to track, classify, and, if necessary, jam foreign detections before they became public. Funding approval came in record time: 38 billion yen. The first phase began immediately. Across Europe, the reaction was slower but no less decisive. ESA, caught between two giants, realized neutrality was untenable. Rather than compete in secrecy, they pivoted toward independence, launching a new proposal for Open Sky, a collaborative, open-source network of small radar stations across member states. Each would contribute raw, unfiltered data to a distributed archive, immune to single-nation control. It was an idealistic countermeasure, a scientific rebellion against the growing weaponization of observation. But without American or Chinese support, it was doomed to remain limited. Even so, within weeks, France, Germany, and Spain had pledged funding, framing it as Europe's last transparent window into the cosmos. That phrase struck a chord among scientists disillusioned by the silence. Open Sky became a symbol of resistance, proof that the pursuit of knowledge still had a place, even in an age of secrecy. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts on both sides began rewriting doctrine. If 3i Atlas was indeed artificial, or even partially so, then its discovery changed the very definition of national defence. Space, once a backdrop for communication and exploration, was now a potential front. And as one Pentagon official phrased it in a closed briefing, if something can come in, then something else can follow. That single thought, simple, logical, terrifying, fueled a cascade of programs across both militaries. In the US, Space Command began developing new infrared long-range observatories, ILROs, satellites capable of detecting faint high-velocity objects beyond Neptune's orbit. Simultaneously, DARPA opened Program Argus, an initiative to experiment with interplanetary early warning systems. In China, the Defense Science and Technology Bureau quietly revived Project Muxi, Wooden Eye, an old research program focused on space-based visual triangulation. Its revival included a cryptic new objective: detection of extra-systemic bodies exhibiting anomalous propulsion behaviour. Both programs were approved within 72 hours of each other. Neither side publicly acknowledged their existence. Inside NASA and CNSA, researchers watched the militarization unfold with mixed emotions. Many had dedicated their lives to pure science, studying light, plasma, and cosmic dust. Now, their expertise was being absorbed into intelligence briefings. Every data set they produced, every line of code they wrote was now stamped with a classification marking. At Goddard Space Flight Center, one astrophysicist described the shift in a private email. "We're no longer studying the universe, we're auditing it." Her words captured a quiet truth. 3i Atlas had turned observation into surveillance and science into reconnaissance. Outside government walls, corporations began to notice the trend and the funding behind it. Private aerospace companies started pitching deep space tracking platforms to national defense agencies. Lockheed Martin, Blue Origin, and SpaceX all proposed satellite constellations capable of early anomaly detection. In China, state-linked firms like CASIC and CETC began advertising multiband radar hybrids, optimized for non-planetary object monitoring. The commercialization of paranoia had begun. Each proposal carried the same promise: never be caught off guard again. Investors listened. By mid-November, shares in satellite manufacturing and radar electronics firms had surged worldwide. The space race had found its sequel, not to reach new worlds, but to protect this one from the unknown. Within the intelligence community, the mindset was clear. 3i Atlas was not an isolated mystery. It was a warning, an interstellar reminder that humanity was not alone, or at least not the only force capable of sending objects across the stars. That possibility was enough to rewrite priorities overnight. Every detection algorithm was recalibrated, every telescope retasked, and every unexplained blip in deep space data was now logged, cross-checked, and in many cases classified before scientists could even see it. A quiet shift had taken hold, a new era where knowing was power and sharing was risk. Amid all this, a single document circulated internally through the US intelligence community, a think piece written by a defense analyst attached to Project Sentinel. It wasn't technical, it was philosophical. The first line read, "Every generation builds telescopes to look outward. We've just built ours to look back." The analyst argued that humanity's relationship with space had inverted, that the same sky once seen as freedom had become a mirror of fear. It was a sentiment shared quietly, even among those signing the funding requests. China too began to realize the irony. Tianyan-2's architects privately admitted that their system's first priority would be detection suppression, blocking foreign sensors from accessing the same anomalies they did. The result would be a world where the next interstellar visitor might appear to only one side of the planet, invisible to the other by design, a geopolitical monopoly on the unknown. From orbit, nothing about this escalation is visible. The stars look the same, but buried in the hum of deep space radar, humanity's instruments are already turning outward, not in curiosity but in fear of missing what comes next. Every ping sent into the void now carries two meanings, one scientific, one strategic, and 3i Atlas, somewhere beyond the sun, drifts quietly onward, unaware that its passing has redrawn the borders of the human sky. By November 1st, 2025, the first signs of information control had already begun to surface. It didn't start with a major announcement or a visible shutdown. It began with silence, subtle, creeping, bureaucratic silence. Files that had been accessible the day before started returning strange errors. Spectral data disappeared from public servers, graphs went blank. Searches for 3i Atlas on academic databases began redirecting to unrelated results. No explanations were given. At first, researchers assumed it was technical, routine maintenance after perihelion, but then, one by one, the datasets didn't come back. The first major disappearance occurred inside NASA's Planetary Data System, the public archive for nearly all deep space missions. A file labelled PSP-3 IATLAS-PEIHELOO-UVDATA-25OCTOBER, one that had contained Parker Solar Probe's ultraviolet readings from the week of perihelion, suddenly went missing. Its listing still appeared in the index, but when opened, the contents were replaced with a single line of text. This dataset has been temporarily restricted pending review. No author, no date, no technical notice. At nearly the same time, the Chinese National Space Science Data Center restricted ASOS telemetry, citing data recalibration. Entire wavelength bands were marked as incomplete. Independent mirrors that had backed up those files were also taken offline, within hours of each other. The synchronization was too precise to be coincidence. By late morning, international researchers began comparing notes. At the European Space Agency, astronomers checking cross-mission logs discovered that both Parker and ASOS records for October 29th to 31st had been replaced by placeholder entries. ESA's metadata revealed something even stranger. All those changes had occurred within the same 3-minute window, at 2:14 UTC, October 31st. The timing matched exactly with the classified moment Parker's raw perihelion data was transferred into Tier 1 clearance. A coincidence, perhaps, but to those watching closely, it looked like coordination. Emails started circulating quietly among researchers. One message from a senior astrophysicist at Caltech read, "Check your backups. Everything referencing nickel is being rewritten." She wasn't exaggerating. In the hours that followed, papers, internal drafts and datasets that mentioned nickel tetracarbonyl began disappearing from institutional servers, not just flagged, deleted, even cached copies were overwritten. A postdoctoral researcher at MIT confirmed that her saved draft had been altered remotely. Her PDF, which originally used the phrase non-gravitational acceleration, now read thermal outgassing irregularity. Same paper, same timestamp, different meaning. Someone was editing the record, word by word. At the Purple Mountain Observatory in Nanjing, Chinese scientists experienced the same phenomenon. When they tried to access their ASOS spectral results, several files returned invalid checksum. The datasets were still there, but the values had changed. The anomalous ultraviolet spike at 218.1 nanometers had been flattened into background noise. One technician, speaking quietly over an encrypted channel, said, "It's like the spectrum was rewritten." The line didn't vanish, it was erased. Across Europe, university networks began logging similar changes. An astrophysics lecturer in Madrid noticed that her slides, which had used Parker's spectral plots, no longer matched the current public version. She tried to download the original graph again, only to receive a 404 error. The same happened in Paris, in Munich, in Cambridge. Everywhere the same phrase appeared, file pending verification. The pattern was unmistakable, the same terminology, the same timing, the same silences, spreading across systems that supposedly operated independently. By the afternoon of November 1st, researchers began compiling screenshots, digital evidence before the deletions could spread further. A small group formed inside an encrypted chat room called Continuum Archive. Its members included astronomers from the US, France, Japan, and Chile, all with partial access to 3i Atlas data. They began cross-referencing file hashes, timestamps, and server logs. What they found was alarming. Nearly every major deletion targeted one of two data categories: spectral composition between 215 to 225 nanometers, orbital residuals between October 29th and November 1st. Everything related to chemical composition and trajectory anomalies was being systematically removed. One researcher wrote in the group chat, They're not deleting random files, they're deleting context. Within hours, social media began showing signs of restriction too. Twitter posts discussing nickel tetracarbonyl in relation to 3i Atlas stopped appearing in searches. YouTube videos analysing perihelion data were suddenly unavailable due to copyright claim. Even on Reddit's space forums, threads vanished seconds after gaining traction. It wasn't just suppression, it was orchestration. The same pattern repeated across Chinese platforms. Weibo, Jihu, Bilibili. Users who mentioned ASO-S or industrial gas emission found their accounts flagged. On both sides of the planet, the silence was growing symmetrical. Some scientists tried to push back. A European research collective uploaded archived copies of Parker's UV data to a decentralized storage system. For a few hours, the files spread rapidly through peer-to-peer networks. Then, by evening, they vanished. Nodes were blocked, accounts suspended. A few users reported receiving emails warning them of data misuse under national security provisions. None of those warnings were signed. At NASA, internal communication became cautious, almost coded. Teams that once collaborated freely began encrypting even harmless exchanges. The phrase data under harmonization review became the standard response whenever someone asked about missing files. No one officially explained what harmonization meant. In Beijing, the same phrase appeared in a Chinese government bulletin, translated almost identically, harmonization of sensitive observational records. To independent scientists watching from outside both systems, it felt like an invisible treaty, one that neither side would ever acknowledge publicly. By nightfall, the deletions had become undeniable. Public records of 3i Atlas's perihelion emissions, once downloaded thousands of times, were now ghosts. Their URL still existed, their metadata still indexed, but their contents had been replaced with silence. Even the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine began returning errors when users tried to access snapshots from the past week. The web itself was being rewritten. And for those who had spent years studying the skies, the realization was devastating. The first truly interstellar anomaly to pass within reach of human instruments, possibly the most important discovery in modern astronomy, was being buried while it was still happening. Tonight, the object is still out there, fading behind the glare of the sun. The data exists, locked behind layers of clearance, mirrored in private servers, whispered about in encrypted threads. But to the public record, it's already vanishing. Not because the science failed, but because the truth became inconvenient. By the evening of November 1st, 2025, the official channels had gone quiet. Every public feed that once tracked 3i Atlas now looped the same lines. Data unavailable. Verification in progress. To most people, it meant nothing. A routine maintenance notice, easily ignored. But inside observatories and research centres, the tone had shifted from confusion to urgency. Scientists knew what was happening. They had seen this before, in smaller ways, but never like this, never so fast. This wasn't a simple data review, it was an erasure in motion, and some refused to let it happen. At the European Southern Observatory, ESO, in Chile, a small team of astrophysicists gathered in a control room after hours. The building was quiet, only the hum of equipment and the low hiss of air conditioning. Outside, the desert sky was black, clear, endless. They connected their internal servers to a cold backup drive, a system physically isolated from the internet, and began downloading every cached record of 3i Atlas telemetry they could still access. Optical data, radar echoes, timestamps, even raw noise files. Each file was duplicated 3 times and hashed with digital signatures to prevent tampering. One researcher, a quiet woman from Portugal, labelled the folder simply Atlas_lives. That phrase would become a quiet rallying cry in the days that followed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic at Harvard's Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, a similar scene was unfolding. Researchers who had worked on Parker Solar Probe's early data were gathering in private Zoom calls under fake names. Their goal wasn't protest, it was preservation. They began storing raw plots in private cloud accounts, zipped under harmless file names like optics_lab_archive or weather_logs. A few resorted to even simpler disguises. Screenshots hidden inside JPEGs of star maps, with file names changed to telescope calibration numbers. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival, academic survival, data survival, truth survival. Because the scientists had learned one thing over the last 48 hours. Once the data vanished from official archives, it never came back. Inside China, the movement took on a different tone. Quieter, more cautious, but no less determined. At the Purple Mountain Observatory, several researchers began encrypting raw ASOS telemetry on portable SSDs and mailing them anonymously to trusted colleagues abroad. They used tourist photos as cover, drives labelled Family Trip 2023, hidden beneath vacation pictures of mountains and lakes. Each contained fragments of ultraviolet spectra, small enough to avoid detection, but vital enough to reconstruct the lost line at 218.1 nanometers. One of those drives reached Hong Kong early this morning. Its contents confirmed what Western scientists had suspected. The emission line was still there, still real, still unexplained. In Paris, an astronomer named Dr. Elodie Marin, working out of the Observatoire de Meudon, created a private server to host mirrored copies of deleted datasets. She called it Continuum Vault, a nod to the encrypted chat room of the same name where scientists had first organised resistance. The vault was simple, password protected, hidden under the guise of a climate modelling portal. But its contents were extraordinary. Side-by-side comparisons of Parker and ASOS spectra, time-synced radar readings from Goldstone, and a reconstructed model of 3I Atlas's outbound trajectory that didn't match any official record. According to her analysis, the object's slight orbital drift continued even after it disappeared from visual range. She noted cautiously in her encrypted log, "The anomaly persists. They're suppressing a moving target everywhere, small acts of quiet defiance multiplied." In Munich, a PhD student printed hard copies of ultraviolet spectra and hid them inside a university archive labelled Defunct Research. In Madrid, a data analyst from IAS used an old amateur telescope to capture 3I Atlas's final visible frame before it slipped behind the sun, not for publication, but for proof that it existed. In Tokyo, an astrophotographer overlaid satellite tracking coordinates on his own star maps, embedding real orbital data into art to bypass filters. Each act on its own seemed small, even futile. Together, they formed a silent rebellion. Hundreds of scientists spread across continents protecting a single truth, that something unnatural had passed through the solar system and their governments wanted it forgotten. At NASA, not everyone complied with the blackout. Inside the Goddard Space Flight Center, a mid-level systems engineer named Aaron Worth began quietly forwarding non-sensitive log files to private researchers overseas. He didn't leak classified information, only what was already public before it was erased. But even that small act of defiance was dangerous. He knew the risk. The servers were monitored, every keystroke logged. So he used a trick, printing the files as PDFs, screenshotting them, and sending the images through a personal email account with subject lines like instrument calibrations. The recipients, astronomers in France, Japan, and Chile, knew exactly what they were looking at. They began calling him the custodian. Inside China, a similar figure emerged, a radio technician identified only by the online alias Haizi, meaning the Dark One. He worked night shift at FAST, maintaining the telescope's receiver arrays. Using spare time and access, he began saving raw frequency logs onto personal USB drives, one per night. Each contained faint radar echoes that he claimed showed repeating modulation, the same rhythmic anomalies later found in US radar data. He sent his last message to the Continuum chat room 2 nights ago. "They are replacing our logs. You must mirror everything. Fast." Then he vanished. His account hasn't been active since. For those still able to communicate, the Continuum chat room became a lifeline. Its messages were sparse, just coordinates, timestamps, hash codes, and warnings. No names, no politics, no speculation, only data. The channel's pinned message written by its anonymous founder read, "Truth has no clearance level." Every night new members joined, university staff, observatory interns, even engineers from satellite companies. Some uploaded small fragments, a calibration image, a radar ping, a missing log. Others uploaded nothing, only reading, watching, waiting. Together, they were piecing together a puzzle that had been deliberately dismantled. But there was one thing even they couldn't explain. The growing synchronization between American and Chinese censorship systems. Deleted posts on Twitter reappeared as censored threads on Weibo. Server restrictions hit both NASA and CNSA within minutes of each other. The same boilerplate text appeared in both English and Mandarin. Data integrity under harmonization process. Someone, or something, was coordinating across nations. The only question was how high that coordination went. Late tonight, a message appeared in the Continuum Vault's hidden channel. It contained a single image, a Parker Solar Probe graph, time-stamped October 30th, 2:03 UTC, the last hour before classification. The ultraviolet spectrum clearly showed the 218.1 nanometer spike. At the bottom of the image, in white letters, a note had been added manually. Do not let them rewrite the sky. No one knows who uploaded it. But within minutes, every member of the network downloaded it. Screenshots spread across encrypted servers worldwide. Silent, wordless, defiant. For now, that image remains intact. A single frame of light, a forbidden wavelength, proof that something extraordinary was seen, even as it's being erased. And as the world sleeps, observatories continue watching, quietly, secretly, stubbornly. Because even if the data disappears tomorrow and the servers fall silent, the people who saw 3i Atlas will remember. They know what they measured, they know what they lost, and they know that silence, no matter how carefully engineered, cannot erase memory. It began just after midnight on November 1st, under skies so still that even the desert wind at Paranal Observatory had gone silent. Most telescopes were pointed elsewhere by then. 3i Atlas had already slipped beyond direct optical range, somewhere behind the sun's blinding arc, hidden from all but the deepest radio arrays. The official word was that tracking had ended. But a few didn't stop. A handful of independent observatories, small, scattered and unofficial, kept their antennas aimed toward the coordinates where 3i Atlas should have reappeared after perihelion. Not because they expected anything, but because they refused to let it vanish completely. What they found that night wasn't light, it was rhythm. At 0046 UTC, the Atacama Low Frequency Array, a private Chilean installation run by volunteers, detected a faint repeating radio pulse emanating from near the object's projected path. The signal was narrowband, fixed around 8.72 MHz, with a cycle of exactly 32.9 minutes between peaks. Too long for standard telemetry, too regular for cosmic noise. At first the operator assumed interference, military radar perhaps, or a local transmission echo. But then he noticed something odd. The pulse intensity didn't fluctuate with the ionosphere, as man-made signals usually do. It stayed constant, unwavering, like a beacon stabilized against the Earth's atmospheric distortion. He logged the anomaly under the label 3IA-RF1. 2 hours later, the same pattern was detected in South Africa, this time by the Hartebeesthoek Radio Astronomy Observatory. The delay between detections matched the Earth's rotation perfectly. Different hemisphere, same signal. By dawn, messages were already spreading through the encrypted continuum channels. RF1 repeating, same cycle, 8.72 MHz. Check your background noise levels. Within minutes, 2 more confirmations arrived, one from Spain's Yebes Observatory, another from a small amateur array in Western Australia. Every observer, independent and unsynchronized, was picking up the same transmission, same frequency, same interval, same silence in between. When they compared timestamps, the pattern formed a perfect global chain, as if the signal had circled Earth, one relay per continent. It wasn't strong enough to be communication, it wasn't weak enough to be random, it was deliberate. At NASA's Goldstone complex, engineers monitoring deep space radar sweeps noticed the same pulse buried deep inside the reflection noise of their outgoing signals. A low-level systems technician flagged it, adding a note: unexplained periodic interference matching outbound transmission delay. The technician never received a response. Within an hour, that section of the Goldstone network log was locked under classified review. Yet someone inside forwarded the log to a private contact, one of the Continuum's members. The timestamps matched. The pulse wasn't local interference, it was echoing back. In Beijing, engineers at the Fast Radio Telescope recorded a nearly identical phenomenon, a steady modulation just below 9 MHz, repeating with the same period. Their data, however, contained something new, a subtle frequency drift, shifting upward by 0.001 Hz at the end of each cycle, barely perceptible, but measurable. A junior analyst proposed it might be Doppler modulation, a signal source in motion, receding from Earth at high speed. When he ran the numbers, the drift aligned almost perfectly with 3I Atlas's projected outbound velocity. He brought the findings to his supervisor. The report was confiscated within the hour. By late afternoon, fragments of the signal began circulating among independent researchers. Audio renderings were created, compressed and slowed so human ears could detect the rhythm. What they heard wasn't a tone or a chirp. It was a pulse, a deep resonant thud repeating every half hour as steady as a heartbeat. Some called it an artifact, some called it interference, but the timing, the precision, the global synchrony, none of it matched known sources. When plotted visually, the waveform formed a symmetrical pattern, rising and falling amplitudes that mirrored themselves across the midpoint of each cycle. One side was a reflection of the other, as if the signal were folding in on itself. It didn't look like communication, it looked like calibration. At ESA's Cebreros station in Spain, engineers quietly ran correlation models between the RF1 pulse and radar echoes from the previous week. They found a near-perfect temporal correlation. The 32.9-minute cycle matched the timing between 3 anomalous radar reflections recorded during perihelion, the same 3-echo pattern that had been dismissed as noise days earlier. That finding was sent up the chain for peer review. It never came back. The file's access record now shows, archived under restricted clearance. By nightfall, the Continuum network had built a rough global profile. The signal wasn't constant. It pulsed, almost predictably. It aligned not with Earth's rotation, but with the heliocentric angle between the planet and the object's last known position, as if the source was orienting itself relative to the Sun, not to us. The implication was unnerving. Whatever was transmitting wasn't pointing at Earth. We were simply in its path. As the night wore on, one of the Continuum astronomers, Dr. Elodie Marin from Paris, attempted a cross-analysis between RF1 and solar wind data. Her model showed that the pulse's intensity fluctuated ever so slightly with the solar flux, rising during coronal mass ejections and fading as the plasma stream thinned. To her, it meant only one thing: the signal wasn't travelling through space unaffected, it was interacting with it. She wrote a single line in her encrypted journal: "If it's a reflection, it's a living one." Around the same time, at the University of Tokyo's Komaba Radio Observatory, a grad student working independently performed an experiment of his own. He inverted the waveform of the RF1 pulse, flipping it vertically, a common trick used in acoustic analysis. What appeared was unnervingly structured, a sequence of harmonic ratios that matched integer multiples of the hydrogen emission line. It was as if the signal were built upon the most fundamental frequency in the universe. He sent the result to his professor. The next day, the lab's network connection was restricted for unusual traffic activity. The student's account was deleted. Everywhere, small pieces of the puzzle began aligning, but no one had the full picture. To most of the world, 3I Atlas was gone, a comet that had come and gone, fading behind the sun. But to the few still watching, something else was unfolding. The pulse had rhythm, precision, and endurance, and if it was real, it had purpose. Inside the Continuum chat room tonight, the messages have slowed. Each member is now uploading the same thing, raw F1 segments from different observatories, stitched together into one continuous file. When combined, the waveform reveals something no one expected. Every 12 cycles, a faint amplitude spike appears, a fourth signal, weaker, higher in frequency, and out of phase with the rest. It wasn't part of the original pattern. One scientist labelled it RF2. Its origin is still unknown, but if 3I Atlas truly emitted the first signal, then something else may now be replying. The transmissions continue as of this hour, faint, rhythmic, indifferent. Whether they come from the object, its debris, or a reflection through the plasma field, no one knows. But one truth has become impossible to deny. The sky, once silent, is no longer still. The discovery came quietly, without ceremony, in the early hours of November 1st, when the world was still pretending 3I Atlas had already passed into history. The first pulses, the repeating 8.72 MHz signal now called RF1 was still being logged by the Continuum network. But that night, something else appeared in the data. A whisper behind the rhythm, a second frequency. It was weaker, almost invisible at first, but mathematically perfect. A clean tone exactly 4 times higher than RF1, sitting at 34.88 MHz, repeating not every 32.9 minutes but every 33.0, a near-perfect mirror, slightly offset, as if responding to the first with a deliberate delay. The signal was found by accident. A systems engineer named Mateo Ruiz, working at the small Alto Carrillo station in northern Argentina, had been monitoring RF1 as part of a global synchronization test. While cleaning up static from the upper ionospheric band, he noticed an identical pattern mirrored at 4 times the frequency. At first, he assumed it was harmonic distortion, a common artifact when strong low-frequency signals bounce off Earth's magnetic field. But when he checked his local noise model, there was no harmonic resonance anywhere near that frequency. The second tone wasn't an echo, it was independent. And stranger still, its phase alignment lagged the RF1 pulse by exactly 4.2 seconds every cycle. When plotted together, the two signals formed a pattern. One pulse calling, one pulse answering. He labelled it RF2. By midday, the Continuum chat room was alive again. Members cross-checked Ruiz's data against recordings from Hartebeesthoek, Cebreros, and FAST. To their astonishment, the same secondary frequency was visible everywhere. Faint, symmetrical, and constant. The offset never changed. RF1 peaked, then 4.2 seconds later, RF2 responded. That short gap became the centre of every discussion. No known astrophysical process produces that kind of timing. Not plasma echoes, not magnetospheric reflections, not earthbound interference. It was too exact and too consistent across hemispheres. At Goldstone, the radar division quietly noticed the same thing. During a scheduled calibration sweep, engineers detected residual reflections not from the direction of 3i Atlas, but from nearly the opposite side of the sky, the region trailing Earth in its orbit near the L5 Lagrange point. The signal there was almost identical to RF2. When one technician ran a cross-correlation, the waveform matched 99.97%. It wasn't random noise, it was the same source. That meant only one thing. RF2 wasn't coming from the object, it was coming from somewhere near us. At first, the team suspected satellite contamination, perhaps a reflection from an old communications array. But when they cross-checked orbital catalogues, nothing lined up. The reflection vector didn't match any known spacecraft or debris trajectory. It was stationary with respect to Earth's orbit, parked at the gravitational stable zone 60 degrees behind the planet, a place rarely monitored and even less understood. In Beijing, analysts at the Strategic Support Force detected the same phenomenon. Their internal memo described it as secondary emission consistent with phase-locked synchronization of unknown origin. Apparent source fixed within the Earth-Sun L5 sector. That memo was sent to the Chinese Academy of Sciences for technical interpretation. Within hours, the forwarding chain ended abruptly. Access logs were sealed. But a copy reached the Continuum through an intermediary who had seen the waveform graphs. The shapes were unmistakable. Twin peaks, rising in tandem like a double heartbeat. By evening, 4 independent stations confirmed that the secondary tone was strongest when Earth's orbit placed it between 3i Atlas and the Sun, as if the second signal were reacting to the first, but relayed locally. In other words, RF1 might be coming from the object, but RF2 was being generated somewhere much closer, almost in sync with Earth itself. Dr. Elodie Marin in Paris spent the rest of the night comparing timestamps. Her results were chilling. Each RF2 pulse began precisely when RF1 reached its lowest amplitude, as if designed to occupy the silence between beats. Together, the two created a continuous waveform with no gap, a perfect interlocking pattern. She sent the plot to the group with a single message. If these are natural, nature is composing. Across the world, reactions split. Some believed RF2 was simply a high-order echo of RF1, radio noise bouncing within the solar wind plasma creating false symmetry. Others saw design, a conversation in code, played out in wavelengths instead of words. Neither explanation fit perfectly. The plasma echo theory failed to explain the fixed delay and orbital alignment. The artificial theory required something impossible, a transmitter at L5 that no one had launched and no telescope had ever seen. But when the Continuum compared the new signal to the archival data from 3I Atlas's perihelion period, one detail stood out. The same 4.2-second offset appeared faintly in the radar reflections from October 29th, the day of the spectral lockdown. The pattern was there all along, buried in the noise. Someone, or something, had answered before we even realized we were listening. At NASA, the response was swift. All radar activities involving deep space reflection in the 8 to 35 MHz range were paused for calibration review. Internally, that meant shutdown. Goldstone's radio window was reassigned to satellite health diagnostics. In truth, they were silencing their own instruments. China did the same. Fast's low-band receivers were under maintenance. No one wanted to admit they had detected a signal whose source neither side could identify or claim. Meanwhile, the independent networks kept listening. In South Africa, a researcher noticed the signal's intensity subtly rising with each cycle, as though it were drawing closer or growing stronger. In Japan, a technician recorded faint amplitude modulation inside the pulse. Small, repeating bursts resembling binary pairs, 10110001. It wasn't language yet, but it was structure. The Continuum combined the data and ran a harmonic decomposition. The result was unexpected. The pulses formed a repeating ratio that corresponded exactly to the orbital resonance between Earth and Venus. RF2 wasn't random background chatter. It was harmonizing with planetary motion. At this hour, the signal is still present, faint, regular, unwavering. Most large observatories have been ordered not to mention it publicly, but the smaller ones, the amateurs, the insomniacs staring into static can still hear it. A steady twin pulse, one distant, fading into the dark, and one close, echoing just behind us. Two signals, two sources, one call, one reply. No one knows what connects them yet, only that they share the same rhythm, and that somewhere near Earth's quiet shadow in space something is listening back. Now, as November 1st, 2025 draws to a close, the object that once illuminated headlines and filled telescopes is gone from view, but not from reach. Its name lingers like static, drifting between classified archives and encrypted servers. The data is fractured, buried, or rewritten, and yet the story refuses to end. Across the world, radar operators still hear faint pulses at the edge of their instruments, signals too symmetrical to dismiss, too faint to declare. Some point outward toward the path of 3 Atlas. Others seem to echo from just behind Earth's orbit, as if something else is waiting, still listening. The agencies have gone quiet, the scientists have gone underground, and the public, unaware of how close the truth might be, sees only the calm of an ordinary sky. But beneath that calm lies something irreversible. The boundaries between astronomy and intelligence have dissolved. Observation has become surveillance, and the line between science and secrecy, once thin, has become a wall. Maybe 3I Atlas was nothing more than an interstellar fragment, a coincidence of chemistry and light. Maybe the signals are echoes of our own transmissions, scattered through plasma and returned by chance. Or maybe they're something older, a kind of cosmic residue, left by a civilization that mastered motion long before we understood it. For now, the instruments keep listening, the pulses keep coming, and the truth drifts somewhere between them, not gone, just obscured, pulsing faintly in the silence between one signal and the next. In the end, 3I Atlas didn't just pass through our solar system, it passed through our certainty. And the sound it left behind wasn't noise or message or proof, it was a question, still unanswered, still alive in the dark,